Alright, hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to make a very simple plugin script, use a single file plugin with the script wizard, and just cover some of the basics of conditional statements using ESAPI. And so what conditional statements are is they are truth statements. So they're going to test whether or not some sort of condition is true. And so this would be like, an if statement, an if, else if, or else, right? Another example would be a switch, where we have different cases. And then the other example I want to cover are conditional operators. And these are examples of single line conditional statements. Okay, so I'd actually already put this together and recorded everything, but the recording was messed up. So we're not going to go through the process of coding everything. We're just going to review everything. So, which may be better. All right. So to catch you up though, if you're new to using Eclipse, I've used the Eclipse script wizard to create a single file plugin called Conditional Statements. And once that was created, it opens. And so I've already, like I said, I've already added in the code. So we're just going to go over it. So I've created some private variables, and these are going to be lists that are used for filtering out the various structures. And so you may have GTVs, CTVs, PTVs, and then you have like your OARs. And let's say in your script, you want to do some things you want to perform some sort of function on all the GTVs, right? Or maybe you want to do something specific with the OARs, like maybe you want to calculate the distance to the targets, right? So you don't want to have to, every time you do something with the structures, you don't want to have to, test to make sure that structure, that you want to do it with that structure, right? So maybe up front, you just want to go ahead and filter your structures so that later on, then you could say for each structure in GTVs, then you know that you're dealing with a GTV, right? Or an OAR. Okay, so conditional statements, again, if, else, if, and else, switch case statements, or just switch statements, and then some one-liners, which are conditional operators. Okay, so for an if statement, for a very simple if statement, let me just go ahead and shrink these down. Okay, so for a very simple if statement, you may want to check whether or not because remember, this is a single file plugin, so this is being run in Eclipse, and it's using the script context, which means that, whatever patient you have open, whatever plan you have open, that is the information that it has at hand. Okay, so if the patient is null, then maybe you don't want to continue. Okay, if the structure set is null, maybe you don't want to continue. And then if the plan setup is null, like maybe your script relies on those things, right? Or maybe you need to check to make sure that dose is calculated, right? Like if you start processing the DVH information, your script will crash if you don't test to make sure that the dose is valid, right? So maybe we want to provide some sort of a check up front, right? So this is testing like if the patient's null, or, so this is like an or operator, or the structure set is null, or the plan setup is null. So this is a very broad check, and that it's very general because it covers a lot of things, and it's just using this or statement means that for each one of these, it's saying if any of these fail, do this, right? Or actually, if any of these are true, do this, right? So, so there has to be a patient, there has to be a structure set, and there has to be a plan setup, right? So otherwise, then we're going to enter this code block, and we're going to end the script, right? Another example would be like an and operator. And so in your if statement, you could say, Like, so instead of, like, maybe you want to make sure there's a patient, right? And then maybe you want to say and then you want to test if either one of these fail. Okay, then you can put those in parentheses. Now this is one. These are two tests, but the result it only returns one result. Okay, so this would be like if the patient is null and either the structure set is null or the plan setup is null. Like maybe you don't necessarily need a plan, right? But if you have a plan setup that has a, like if you're making the assumption that the plan setup that is pulled in actually has a structure set, because this wouldn't be a good check because if you're familiar with planning, in Eclipse you don't actually have to have a structure set associated with a plan. You could create a clinical plan, and so this would not be a good example of a robust check. But the point is just to show the use of the and operator. So if you would say if the patient is null and the structure set or the plan setup is null, then do this. Okay, so obviously if there's a structure set pulled in, then we have a patient, right? So this may not be the best example, but yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to change that back. Okay, all right. So the difference are or. So this is or. So I can just write that in. Or equals this. And then we'll say and. So if you're familiar with like Boolean operators, then that's what that is. Okay. All right. So that's just a basic if statement. That's just a simple if statement, right? So now we're gonna go into using an if, else if, and an else statement. And you don't have to have the else, but what this will do is it will say the first test will say if the structure ID contains GTV, then we're going to add it to the GTVs. Else if, and then so by using else, the difference between else if and else is that else if allows you to have another test, another conditional statement. Okay, else just means if that's not true, then this is like your default. Okay, so if none of these are true, then we're just going to do this, right? So let me back up a second. So what I've done is I've looped through each structure in the structure set, okay? And this is the short way. This right here is the short way. So I could comment this out, bring this back in, bring this back in, and this, okay? And then if I hit Control KD, it will fix all of those issues. Actually, we need to get rid of this one. Okay. All right. So we'll just delete that. Okay. So we're saying for each. Oh, that's what it was. So we actually need that. Okay, there we go. All right, so for each structure in the structure set, we're going to loop through. So S is just short for structure, and that's just what I've put. You could absolutely type in structure. If the structure has a segment, if that's true, and if the structure is empty, then I want to do some, some tests, right? So if the structure does not have a segment or it is empty, then it won't enter this code block, right? So it's just going to skip that structure. Or you could add in an else, and you could say, maybe it's a marker, and then you would add it to that. What I've done to simplify it is I've changed this into a single line link query, here. Okay. And so I've simplified this test into this single line right here. So this is using a where link statement. Link is LINQ if you want to search that on Google. And we're saying that for each structure in the structure set where it is not empty and where it has a segment, then we're going to do this stuff. So we're actually only going to loop through the structures that meet these requirements. Okay. All right. So, that in and of itself is a conditional statement, right? So, and it's just a truth test, right? So we're checking whether or not this is true and whether this is true. Okay. Or, well, whether this is false. Well, actually we're checking whether this statement is false. Right, so because you could simplify this and say, if we comment that out, then we would say if it's not empty, right? So if you add in an exclamation point in front of a Boolean, then it will say the opposite, right? And we're checking this test. So if it is empty, that would be true. Well, we don't want that. Right? So we want it if it's not empty. So then you would say not is empty, right? So when you do that though, it can be like, this is a little confusing, right? So that's why I wrote it out more explicitly so that it is a little bit more clear. Like when I'm coming back through and reading through this, I can say, okay, so this is empty, so that would be true if it is empty. So we want it when it's not empty, so we would want this value to be false. Okay, so it's checking if it's false, great. Okay, and then has segment, right? Has segment's a little more straightforward because the result of it would be true, right? If it has a segment. So it's a little easier to use, right? So if it has a segment, we would just know, okay, well, that makes sense. It would be true. Okay, so that's just an example of a single line, filter. Okay, so then so for each structure that is not empty and that has a segment, then, and the reason that we have to test for both of these is that if it's empty, then I think that would be like structures that have like a marker, or that are like a marker or an isocenter. So technically they're still structures. So, and then has a segment. Well, actually, so is empty, that would mean like if it doesn't have any, like if it doesn't have a segment volume, okay? So, but that would also return things like markers and things like that, I think. And then has segment would be like if it has a segment volume. So, any actual structure that you would use. So like an isocenter or a marker, I don't think that wouldn't pass this test, but I think it would pass this test. Okay. So anyway, so for each structure, we're going to check if the ID contains GTV. And this to upper, what this will do is, let's say the var GTV equaled, maybe they spelt it like, GTV, like maybe they accidentally did that, or maybe probably a more common one is GT with a lower V, right? Well, then if we didn't have this to upper, then it would fail, right? So one of the things when you're testing, especially like user input, things that rely on the user to do things correctly, you want to take as much of the guesswork out. And so you can convert it to a lower or to an upper, and then you would, if you did to lower, then you would just say this, right? Okay, so the ID to upper, if it contains GTV, all uppercase, then we're going to add it to GTVs. Else, if the ID to upper contains CTV, then we're going to add it to the CTVs list, and then this, the same for PTVs. And then if none of those are true, like if none of these conditional statements are true, then else we're going to check if it contains couch, and we want to make sure that that is false. Then we want to add that to our OARs, okay? Because we just, maybe you just don't want to grab your OARs, okay? Now, if you notice, here we have, everywhere else we have these brackets. Well, if you're new to programming, then you may see this and be like, oh, so I don't need brackets. Well, you only don't need brackets if you're only going to continue to one line, okay? So you see how this is 2 lines of code, whereas this is 4, right? So if you're only going to add one thing, then you could condense that down to something like this. But if the moment that we go down to this next line, then maybe we want to do something else, right? I don't know. For whatever reason, let's say we had another list that was like structures.add. Whoop. And we don't, so that's why it's complaining. But let's just say that we did. And if you notice, when I added the semicolon, I have the settings set so that it will fix my line spacing. Well, if you're familiar with Python, you know that indentation is key, right? If you indent it, it needs things to be indented properly, right? So you could do an if statement, and then actually in Python, you would have a colon here, right? And then everything below it that's indented is inside that if statement. Well, that's not the way it is for C#. You actually need, if you're going to have multiple lines, you need this, okay? You need these brackets, these code brackets. So now, if we put that in there, and we could just do control dot to generate a field, just so it will stop complaining. And then we'll just say, what is it wanting? Oh, it doesn't know what it is. Okay, so let's just do this. And you wouldn't necessarily do this, in your private statement, but you would probably initiate it down in your public script or whatever, or in your script method. But anyway, so, and let's see, I think, it wants a structure. So, yeah, so that would satisfy that. Okay, so the point is, though, that, if you're going to have multiple lines beneath an if statement, then you would want to have it in this code block. Now, you could, technically speaking, if you had you could do something like this. Oh, sorry, that's my dog. The house is starting to wake up. So, okay, so you could do something like this if you wanted to scrunch this down into one line. Okay, so this would satisfy, because everything's in that code block, right? But probably when it gets compiled, it's going to be, lengthened, or not. I don't know. But yeah. So anyway, so that's it's harder to read, right? This is easy because it's only 2 things, right? We're only testing 2 things, or doing 2 things, so it's not really that difficult. And then, okay, so that's an example of if, else if, and an else statement, okay? And then all I did here was I just cleared the lists, just so that if you were to run this script, it wouldn't, and if you were like going to present a message with all the structures, like maybe you want to present a message with the GTVs and then the CTVs, whatever, just that way it wouldn't have duplicates, right? Or if you wanted to test another thing you could test, you could say, this would actually be, well, I'll get to that in a second, right? So like if we did not clear this, then maybe, let's say there's a GTV, right, where the name GTV isn't in it, or for whatever reason we didn't pass this test, but maybe the DICOM type is still GTV, right? So down here, this is an example of a switch statement or a case switch or a switch case, depending on how you say it or whatever. But in a switch statement, you have switch and then case. And then you also have default. So so what we're doing, we're just looping through the same way. We're looping through the structures in the structure set where they're not empty and they have a segment, okay? And then we have this, we're checking, what we're doing is we're adding a switch statement. So we're going to switch, to add a switch statement, you just type switch and then tab, and it will give you this snippet. And so what it wants you to do is it wants you to add in the expression that's going to be switched on or tested. Okay, so for each structure, we're going to check or test the DICOM type. Okay, okay, and then you hit enter, and it will fill it out for you. Well, a DICOM type is a string, so it doesn't know what all to put here. But let's say that let's say the Eclipse scripting API had very explicit types where it was a type DICOM type dot GTV, DICOM type PTV, and they were actual types and not strings. Okay, if it knows what all of the options are for the DICOM type, then it will actually fill it out for you. And that's the nice thing of using the switch snippet. You could just very easily just type this, right? But if you use a snippet, if you're using something that has very discrete values or possibilities, then it can fill it out for you. And so that's just really nice. So like it would have said, case GTV, case CTV, case PTV, etc. Right? And not only that, but it would have added like all the other ones, because it would have added like marker, all these other things. So that's just a little side note. But anyway, so this is a switch statement, and so we're switching on every structure. We're going to check the DICOM type, and then in the case that the DICOM type is GTV, right? Then we're going to add it to the GTVs. Okay, so this test is different from here because we're checking the ID to see if it contains GTV. Whereas here we're checking the DICOM type to see if it is or if it equals GTV. Okay, so this is very discrete in that it needs to be this exactly. We're not checking. It's a little less flexible. So this is really good if you have very explicit or well-defined types or that sort of thing, well-defined like situations that are going to be there, right? So we know that there is a DICOM type GTV, and so hopefully the user, whoever drew the GTV selected it as DICOM type GTV. Now they could have selected it as organ, right? Then then you'd be oopso, right? So but maybe this would be a good example of here we're gonna grab all the ones that contain GTV, and then here anything else that, because we didn't clear it, anything that meets this that has the DICOM type GTV, then we're going to grab that too. So chances are if it has a DICOM type GTV, it's probably named something with a GTV, but maybe, whatever. So this is just an example. Excuse me. So we're going to, so if it's if the DICOM type is GTV, then we're going to do this. Then we're going to break out of this switch statement, okay? And we're going to move to the next structure because we don't need to keep checking these things, right? So if this fails, then okay, well, if it's a CTV, then we're going to do this. And then if it's a PTV, we're going to do this, right? But it's going to break out each time, okay? And that's a requirement in a switch statement. Okay, then down here, and if you remember when we just created one, it already includes the default, okay? And so that's another requirement of a switch statement, is that you always have to have a default case. That way, if none of the situations are true or meet, then it will do something else, right? And you could just say return or break or whatever. Like, you don't have to do anything. Like, technically what we probably should do is do a case organ, okay? And then OARs.add S, right? And then we'll break out of that. And it's complaining because I haven't broken yet. Okay. And I wonder if I do case. No, if I did, I was wondering if I did hit tab. So yeah, so there's not a snippet for just case. That would be nice if it added, you know, case and then whatever and then break. That would be nice. But anyway, so you need the case and then you have to have this colon and then you need a break statement. Okay. So then maybe here we'll say structures. Right, since we added that other list to kind of as a kind of a catch-all, right? And then, you know, you don't have to do anything though. You could say, well, if it's a GTV, CTV, PTV, or organ, then I want to do something, and then if not, then I just want to break out of it. I don't really need to process it, right? Okay, so this is an example of a switch statement. Oh, and then what I was going to say is, like, if you wanted to combine this with this, right, then what you could do is you could check, we could add another conditional statement to say if gtvs.contains s, you know, so we would say if it's false, then add it, right? Because there's no reason to have two structures of the same in the list. Now, if you didn't do this and you wanted to, you know, loop through like each GTV and maybe it had duplicates, right? You could say for each bar GTV and GTVs dot distinct. Okay, now it will only loop through each GTV once, right? Because now it's going to filter out any duplicates, okay? So that's like another example of, this is I want to say this is, I can't remember if this is a link, LINQ method or not. I can't remember. It might be. If we could test it by, so if we get rid of this system.link, we'll know. Yep, it requires a link. Okay, so if we do control dot, it says using system.link. So if you spell things correctly, even though you don't have it in the thing, it will do a pretty good job of guessing where it needs to come from. So that would be like an example of filtering out. So you could do this instead of this, right? The only thing is, like, if you're looping through your structures a bunch of different times, like maybe you're doing a bunch of different operations in different places in your code, then, you know, this method, the expense of this could add up. Whereas here, you're just checking once. Well, actually, I guess you're checking it for every structure that has a die contact GTV. I don't know. This would probably, in a large application where you're doing a lot of different things, this would probably be less expensive computationally. Like in the long run, I don't know. But if you're only doing this in one place, then why check every single time? Why not just filter once? I don't know. Doesn't really matter. So this would be an example of filtering out duplicates. Okay. And this would be example of filtering out. Well, it's not really filtering out, of maybe ignoring duplicates, right? So, all right, so then that's a switch statement. And then the last one that I want to cover is conditional operators, or are conditional operators. And these can be very useful because they can be put into, we'll go ahead and put the operators. Okay, these are the syntax that you'll use for when you're using a conditional operator, like a single line conditional operator. Okay, so if you're doing it the long way, so let's say we're looping through the structures again, and let's say we're presenting a report where we want to, instead of saying true or false, we want to say yes or no, right? So we're going to check if the structure is empty, and if it is, we're going to say the value is yes or no, right? So we do this in 1, 2, 9 lines, right? So that's not terrible, but we could shrink this down into a single line, which would be a lot easier, right? So into 2 lines, I guess, really. And you could if you commented all of this out, then you would just say string is empty. So in a single line, you could check if s.isEmpty is true. So if this property of the structure is true, then yes, we're going to return yes. If not, if it's false, then we're going to return no. Okay, so the things that you need up here, you'll see this question mark and the colon. So you have your string is equal to this conditional operator, okay? And the conditional operator, if it is true, then you're going to have a question mark, and then these are your results, or these are your values. The first one is your true value, and then you're going to have, and then the second one, the one after the colon, this is what's going to happen if the conditional operator returns false, okay? So you have your conditional operator, and I put it in parentheses so that just to show that if it helps you, kind of visually see it all together, like closed off, then you could technically add brackets there, or parentheses rather. Okay, so then another example would be, let's say if it's a PTV. So is PTV, we're going to check the DICOM type. If it's PTV, then we're going to say yes or no, right? And then another one would be target type. So this would be an example of putting multiple conditional operators into a single line. So in this one, we're first checking to see if it's a PTV. If it is, then we're going to assign the target type PTV. And then if it's a CTV, so if it's not a PTV, then this is going to run, right? This is the false portion. And so if this is false, right? So if it's false, then we're going to check if it's a CTV, and if that's true, then we're going to add in we're going to say the target type is CTV, and then if it's not, we're going to say other. Okay, and this could continue on, right? So we could instead of adding if we were saying var target type, and then if it's a GTV, then we would assign it GTV. If it's a CTV, then it etc. Instead of doing all of that, we've been able to condense all of that into one line. Okay, so, and then the other one is another example is like a Boolean. So if we want to, instead of converting it to a string, we could say, we could assign like a Boolean. So we're going to check, is the PTV, and I'm going to get rid of this. Well, actually, I left it because we have is PTV up here. We have a string version up here. So is PTV Boolean, so you could ignore the Boolean if you want. The condition is if the DICOM type is equal to PTV, then we're going to return true. If not, we're going to return false. So for the structure, if the DICOM type is PTV, if that is true, then this value later on would be true, right? So then that would be an example. This would be an example, of how you might use something like that. Okay, now this is we're writing all of this out. We could very easily condense it to just the conditional statement. So this conditional statement, what I think is important to realize is that this conditional statement returns something. Okay, so it's going to return true or false, just like this. Okay, so this conditional statement is going to return true or false, right? And same thing here. This conditional statement is going to return true or false. What happens is with this conditional operator, you have this question mark, which allows you to designate a true and a false value. So like a value if it's true and a value if it's false. Well, if you don't need that, if you're just returning a Boolean, then you can simplify it to just setting it equal to your conditional statement, right? So this is PTV Boolean simplified would be we're returning true if it's true and then false if it's false, right? So we could very easily just set it equal to whatever this test returns, okay? So you don't have to, if you were going to do something like that, you don't have to do that. So like, and then like later on, you might say something like, if we copied this, right? So now we do this, right? Well, if that's all you're going to do, that's kind of silly because you could instead just put that here, right? Well, you would just get rid of this, right? So you could very easily just replace that. Like there's no need to create this variable unless maybe you want to use it in multiple times or multiple places or something like that, or you just want to have something that's very clearly spelled out as to what this test is, right? But that's basically the same thing, right? Okay, we'll get rid of that. All right, so I think that will do it for this video. It's turned into kind of a long one, but anyway, I'm gonna push this code to the repo on GitHub, and I think in the pretty soon I'm going to actually I think I forgot to cover this because I covered it in my original video, but the recording failed. So let's see. Let's see if we go to GitHub. This, okay. So if you've been following along, you'll know that we've started that, like we have this repository where we're keeping our projects. And so we've been working on a conformity check script. And we've gotten to the point to where we've written a view, a user interface for a single file plugin. And if you've looked at it at all, it looks very complicated. And so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to start going into WPF and like ways that you can write your user interfaces using a view and a view model and that sort of thing. So that's the next step in that project. But I've added this other repository to contain some of the different videos, the code that we've used for some of like the introductory videos to C# or to ESAPI or something like that. So this repository is going to host stuff like this, and you can see there's this true statements. This is actually going to go away pretty soon, and you'll see the conditional statements project that we just did. Like I said, I did this before, and the video didn't record well. So anyway, those are our next steps. So if you want to follow along, then be sure to like and subscribe, and then let me know. Be sure to let me know in the comments. I try to read all of them. So at least for now. And so if you have any things that you want to learn, or that you have been trying to learn, or that you just want a video on, just be sure to leave that down in the comments. And yeah, until then, I hope you have a great day.